It was early morning when I heard the rumble of a car pulling up the dirt driveway. The countryside air was still crisp, the dew clinging to the blades of grass like tiny jewels reflecting the rising sun. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked out to the porch, curious to see the young man my sister had entrusted to my care for 2 weeks. My nephew. I hadn't seen him in years, not since he was a lanky, awkward teenager. But as the car door swung open and he stepped out, I nearly didn't recognize him. He had grown. Broad shoulders, defined arms visible under the short sleeves of his shirt, and a quiet confidence in his stride that hadn't been there before. His dark hair was tousled as if he'd been running his hands through it during the drive, and when he smiled, it was with a mix of familiarity and something new that I couldn't quite place. "Auntie Lena," he called, his voice deeper than I remembered. "Danny," I replied, stepping off the porch and pulling him into a warm hug. His arms wrapped around me firmly, and for a moment, I held on just a little longer than I should have, surprised at the comfort his presence brought. "Mom sends her love," he said as we pulled apart. "And a list of things I'm not allowed to eat because of my allergies." I laughed, taking the folded note from him and slipping it into my pocket without even glancing at it. "I think the fresh air will do you more good than any diet restrictions." He chuckled and grabbed his duffel bag from the trunk. "I hope you're right." As we walked toward the house, I found myself studying him out of the corner of my eye. His jawline was sharper, his movements more assured. The boy I remembered had been replaced by a man, and the realization left a strange flutter in my chest. I brushed it off as nostalgia, chalking it up to the loneliness of living in the countryside for so long. Inside, the smell of freshly baked bread filled the kitchen. I handed Danny a plate of food and watched as he devoured it, his appetite reminding me of summers when he and my sister used to visit during school breaks. Back then he was all gangly limbs and boundless energy, chasing chickens around the yard and climbing the old oak tree out back. "Do you still have that treehouse?" he asked as if reading my mind. I smiled. "It's probably a little cramped for you now, but it's still there." After breakfast we took a walk through the fields, the tall grass brushing against our legs. Danny marveled at the simplicity of it all. The wide-open skies, the sound of birdsong, the way the wind whispered through the trees. I realized how different his life in the city must be, surrounded by noise and concrete. "I could get used to this," he said, lying back on the grass and staring up at the clouds. "You might change your mind after a few days of hard work," I teased, nudging him gently with my foot. "You're helping me with the garden, remember?" He groaned playfully. "I was hoping you'd forget." "Never," I said, laughing. "Now come on. We've got vegetables to plant." The days passed in a blur of activity, digging, planting, watering. Danny was strong, his muscles flexing as he hoisted bags of soil and carried buckets of water. I tried not to stare, but it was hard not to notice the way the sunlight caught the beads of sweat on his skin or the way his shirt clung to his back when he bent over to pull weeds. At night we sat on the porch, the cool evening breeze washing over us as we sipped iced tea. The stars above were brilliant, more vibrant than anything you could see in the city. Danny leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the sky. "I can't remember the last time I felt this relaxed," he admitted. "It's peaceful here." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "That's why I stayed," I said softly. "After everything fell apart in the city, I realized I needed this. The quiet, the simplicity. It's healing." He turned to look at me, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever get lonely, Aunt Lena?" I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But it's not the kind of loneliness that's unbearable. It's more of a quiet ache, like missing something you've learned to live without." Danny was silent for a moment, his eyes searching mine. "I'm glad I'm here," he said finally. "So am I," I whispered. That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me. There had been something in his gaze, something deeper than simple affection. It made me uneasy, not because it was unwelcome but because it stirred something in me that I hadn't felt in years. The next day we worked side by side in the garden, our hands covered in dirt and our laughter filling the air. But there was a new awareness between us, an unspoken understanding that neither of us dared to address. When his hand accidentally brushed against mine, I felt the warmth of his skin linger long after the contact had ended. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Danny suggested we take a walk to the treehouse. I agreed, though my heart raced as we made our way through the overgrown path. The treehouse was exactly as I remembered it, weathered but sturdy, its wooden steps creaking beneath our feet. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of old wood and memories. We sat on the floor, our shoulders touching as we looked out through the small window at the darkening sky. "Do you remember when you got stuck up here during a storm?" I asked, laughing softly. "How could I forget? You climbed up and carried me down. You were crying so hard," I teased. "I thought I'd never get you to let go of that branch." He chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. But when he turned to face me, his laughter faded, replaced by something else. Something I couldn't ignore. "Aunt Lena," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about something, and I don't know if I should say it." I held my breath, unsure of what he was about to confess. The air between us felt heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. "You don't have to say anything," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "I think I already know." The silence stretched, filled with the weight of everything we weren't saying. But in that moment, under the canopy of stars and surrounded by the memories of summers past, it didn't matter. We had 2 weeks together. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't lonely. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting golden beams over the dew-covered grass. The soft clinking of the metal pail echoed in the crisp air as I milked Bessie, the old cow who had become something of a companion to me over the years. My hands moved in practiced motions, the rhythm soothing in a way only the countryside could provide. I could hear the distant chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves as a breeze passed through the yard. Everything was calm, peaceful, until I felt that familiar tingle at the back of my neck. The sensation you get when you know someone is watching you. I didn't turn around at first. I knew it was Danny. He had a way of being present without announcing himself, slipping into the quiet of the morning like he was meant to be there. I smiled to myself, amused by how easily he had fit into this slower pace of life. I had expected him to be restless, bored even. After all, he was an 18-year-old boy used to the chaos of the city. But instead he seemed to thrive here, like he was discovering something about himself that had been hidden beneath the noise of urban life. "Good morning, Aunt Lena," his deep voice called out, warm and familiar. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, leaning against the wooden fence with his arms crossed casually over his chest. His hair was messy from sleep, and he wore the same t-shirt from the night before, slightly wrinkled but clinging to his broad frame in a way that made my breath hitch for a moment. I quickly turned my attention back to the pail, hoping he hadn't noticed my reaction. "Morning, Danny," I replied, my voice light. "You're up early." He chuckled and pushed off the fence, walking toward me with that easy confidence I was beginning to recognize as new. This wasn't the same awkward boy I remembered. This was a young man who seemed aware of the effect he had, though he never flaunted it. "I couldn't sleep," he said, coming to stand next to me. "Figured I'd see what you were up to." "Milking Bessie, as you can see," I teased, gesturing to the cow. "It's not exactly thrilling." He grinned. "Maybe not, but I've never done it before." "Think you could teach me?" I laughed, wiping my hands on a cloth and scooting over to make room for him on the stool. "All right, city boy. Let's see what you've got." Danny sat down beside me, his knee brushing mine as he adjusted himself on the small stool. The contact was brief, but it was enough to make me hyper-aware of how close we were. I cleared my throat, hoping to shake off the sudden flutter in my chest. "Okay, so you want to grip gently," I explained, demonstrating the motion. "If you're too rough, Bessie won't be happy." He nodded, his expression serious as he tried to mimic my movements. His hands, larger than mine, fumbled a bit at first, but he quickly found a rhythm. I couldn't help but smile at the concentration on his face, the way his brows furrowed in determination. "You're a natural," I said, nudging him playfully with my elbow. He laughed, and the sound warmed me more than the morning sun ever could. "Don't say that too soon. I might quit my city life and come live here with you." The words were said in jest, but there was a softness to them that made me pause. I studied him for a moment, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the way the morning light caught the faint stubble on his jaw. He looked so at ease, so content, and for a brief second I let myself imagine what it would be like if he stayed. But I couldn't let that thought linger. "You wouldn't last a week," I teased, standing up and stretching my arms above my head. "There's more to this life than milking cows." Danny followed suit, towering over me as he stood. "I don't know," he said, his gaze lingering on me in a way that made my heart race. "I think I'd like it here." I laughed to hide my nerves and walked toward the house, calling over my shoulder, "We'll see how you feel after you help me clean out the chicken coop." He groaned dramatically, but I could hear the laughter in his voice as he followed me inside. The rest of the day passed in a blur of chores and small moments that felt heavier than they should have. Danny was everywhere, helping me hang laundry on the line, carrying baskets of vegetables from the garden, and offering to fix a loose board on the porch that I hadn't gotten around to repairing. His presence was comforting, but it was also unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. I found myself watching him when I thought he wasn't looking, noticing things I shouldn't have. The way his shirt clung to his back when he bent over, the way his hair fell across his forehead when the wind blew just right. And then there were the hugs. He hugged me a lot, more than I expected. At first, they were casual. A quick embrace when he passed me the basket of eggs, a playful squeeze when I teased him about his terrible chicken herding skills. But as the day wore on, the hugs lingered. He held me just a little longer, his arms wrapped around me like he didn't want to let go. And each time I felt something inside me stir. A warmth, a longing, a reminder of just how lonely I had been. By the time evening came, I knew I needed space. I couldn't trust myself, not with the way my heart skipped every time he smiled at me, or the way his compliments made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Danny," I said softly as we stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "I think I need to go into town tomorrow." "Alone?" He frowned, his brows knitting together in confusion. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," I rushed to assure him, placing a hand on his arm. "It's not you. It's just, I need some time to clear my head." He studied me for a moment as if trying to decipher the meaning behind my words. Then slowly he nodded. "Hey, Aunt Lena. But if you need anything, you know I'm here, right?" I smiled, my heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. "I know." That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a mess of conflicting emotions, guilt, longing, and the quiet hum of something I wasn't ready to name. I thought about the way Danny had held me, the way his hands had lingered on my back as if he was afraid to let go. I thought about the way his gaze had softened when he complimented me earlier, saying I looked happy out here in the countryside. I had been lonely for so long. But with Danny here, that loneliness had been replaced by something equally dangerous. Hope. And hope, I knew, was a fragile thing. The morning dew clung to the grass as I stood by the front door, my small overnight bag resting at my feet. The sky was just starting to blush with the first hints of dawn, casting soft pink and orange hues across the horizon. The air smelled of fresh earth and morning mist, a reminder of the quiet life I had built for myself here. A life I was now trying to escape, at least for a day. I had told myself that going into town would give me clarity. I needed distance from the storm brewing inside me, from the warmth that had taken root in my chest whenever Danny was near. But as I turned to close the door behind me, I heard the soft creak of floorboards. My breath hitched when I saw him standing there, leaning against the doorway of the living room. His hair was messy as if he'd just rolled out of bed, and his t-shirt hung loosely on his frame. His eyes, still clouded with sleep, met mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "You're leaving?" His voice was soft, but the weight of his words pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. I swallowed hard and nodded. Just for the day. I need to pick up some things in town. Danny's gaze dropped to the floor for a moment, his hands sliding into the pockets of his sweatpants. He looked younger like this, vulnerable in a way I wasn't used to seeing. You didn't say anything last night. I didn't want to wake you, I lied, though the truth sat heavy on my tongue. I hadn't told him because I knew how hard it would be to leave if I saw that look. The one he was giving me now, filled with concern and something deeper that we hadn't dared to name. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us until he was just a breath away. I could see the shadows under his eyes, the way his jaw clenched like he was holding back words he didn't know how to say. Aunt Lena, are you okay? The question broke something inside me. I had spent so long pretending that I was fine, that I was content with the life I had created here, but Danny saw through it. He always had. From the moment he arrived, he had peeled back the layers of my carefully constructed facade with his warmth, his kindness, and the way he made me feel like I wasn't invisible anymore. I'm fine, I whispered, but my voice cracked, betraying me. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm. The touch was gentle, but it sent a shiver down my spine. You don't have to go, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Stay. Please. I closed my eyes, willing the tears to stay hidden. Danny, but before I could finish, his hand cupped my cheek, tilting my face toward him. His thumb brushed away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen, and my breath hitched at the tenderness of the gesture. You don't have to run, he said softly. Not from me. Not from this. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The weight of his words settled over me, and for the first time, I allowed myself to really feel the depth of what had been growing between us. The stolen glances, the lingering touches, the way his presence filled the empty spaces in my life. It wasn't just infatuation or loneliness. It was something real. And I was terrified. Danny, this is complicated, I said, my voice trembling. You're my nephew. This shouldn't be happening. He shook his head, his eyes never leaving mine. I know how it sounds, but I also know what I feel. And I think you feel it too. The air between us felt heavy, charged with unspoken emotions that were finally breaking free. I wanted to deny it, to push him away for his own good, but the truth burned on my lips. I do, I admitted, my voice barely audible. But it doesn't make it right. He stepped closer, his forehead resting against mine. Maybe it's not about what's right. Maybe it's about what we need. Before I could respond, his lips brushed against mine, soft, tentative, as if he was giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. My body betrayed me, leaning into him as the kiss deepened, gentle yet desperate, like we were both afraid of what would happen if we stopped. His hands slid around my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melt into him, the weight of my worries dissolving in the warmth of his embrace. When we finally pulled away, we were both breathless. My hands clung to the fabric of his shirt, as if letting go would mean waking up from a dream I wasn't ready to leave. I don't want to go, I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Danny's eyes lit up with a mix of relief and something tender, something that made my chest ache in the best way. Then stay, he said, his thumb tracing small circles on my waist. Stay with me. I nodded, tears streaming down my face as I let go of the fear that had been holding me back. Okay. We spent the rest of the morning on the porch, wrapped in blankets as we watched the sun climb higher in the sky. Danny held me close, his arm draped over my shoulders, and for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. His presence was a balm to the loneliness I had grown so accustomed to, and I realized how much I had missed being cared for, being seen. You're too good to me, I said, resting my head against his chest. He pressed a kiss to the top of my head. You deserve it. The day passed in a blur of quiet moments that felt like stolen treasures. We cooked breakfast together, laughing when Danny burned the toast and tried to blame it on the old stove. We took a walk through the fields, his hand slipping into mine as if it had always belonged there. And in the afternoon, when the sun was high and the world felt warm and alive, we lay in the grass talking about everything and nothing. You're different, I said, tracing lazy circles on his arm. You've grown so much. So have you, he replied, his gaze soft as he studied me. You've always been strong, but now, you're letting yourself be vulnerable. That's strength too. I smiled, leaning in to press a kiss to his cheek. You're wise beyond your years, you know that? Or maybe you just bring it out in me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I realized that I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't running from my feelings, from the connection that had blossomed between us. It wasn't conventional and it wasn't without complications, but it was real. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. Danny held me close, his fingers gently tracing patterns on my back. "Stay with me," he whispered, and this time, I knew there was no hesitation in my answer. "I will,"